If you're here for Gardens of Time, I'm starting right at the overlook. Santa Cruz Mission State Historic Park has an amazing view of the downtown area. And I want to look at this landscape, but also think about how it would have appeared a couple of hundred years ago, prior to European contact. And of course, if we were looking out at this during that period of time, we would have to take away some of the things that are in our view shed right now. We would subtract the roads and the cars and trucks and vehicles. We would take away all these buildings. And the other thing I'm noticing about the landscape in front of us, downtown Santa Cruz has an awful lot of greenery and a lot of trees. We can see the profiles of eucalyptus out there. We can see the dark green redwoods. We can see so many trees that enrich our landscape and our city. They're beautiful to look at. They give us shade and shelter, and of course air to breathe, and so many gifts. But if we were looking at this view a couple of hundred years ago, there wouldn't have been trees. Along the San Lorenzo waterway, we would have seen willows, we would have seen some alders and some other trees along the riverside. But most of this landscape would have been coastal scrub around us, probably to coastal prairie. And of course, that would have left a low profile and a wide open horizon. From here, we would have been looking directly at the Monterey Bay to the south of us, and we would have been able to see the ocean from here. So thinking about trees for native people that would have been living in this area, they would have had the trees along the waterway, but I'm going to turn the camera here. Give ourselves a little flip. And just check out that beautiful dark treetop behind the building. It's a live oak tree, and this actually wouldn't have been an area where we would have found a lot of oak trees, but for Ohlone people, they would have made use of many different sections and areas of their homelands, of their territory, and at the right times of year they would be out at the oak orchards, which would have been a little further inland, gathering during and harvesting during the fall and maintaining those orchards, maintaining those groves of oaks during other times of the year by burning and other practices. So that's just an inkling of thinking about trees in the native landscape right around here. I'm going to turn our camera a little further around here, and I'm going to bring us in across the patio for a close-up of one of these trees that is a gorgeous sign of spring. So we're focusing in on this tree in front of us, and I'm going to get us close enough so that we can really view some of the blossoms up here. Leaves waving in the wind, and this tree is just got some lovely blooms on it. Now, a week ago or so, you would have been able to see this tree just full of blooms. It had rain and wind right here in the middle of April, and that shattered a lot of those blossoms. I hope wherever you are right now, you have a view out your or through your neighborhood of some of the gorgeous and really hopeful signs of spring. The tree that we're looking at is a fruit tree. Some of you might be taking guesses out there what kind of tree it is, or maybe you've been here and you know that this is an apple tree, and that makes us think, how did a tree like this arrive in Santa Cruz? Where are our apple trees and many of our fruit trees coming from? And if we're talking about the Mission era, this is when a lot of stone fruits, apples, citrus, along with things like olives are coming because the Spanish are bringing them. And think about this, they're bringing saplings and seedlings, seed banks, in drawers, in cabinets, on ships across the ocean from Spain, and planting them in places like right here in Santa Cruz. And of course, apples are a really productive and important part of our agricultural story nowadays in this region. Extra points out there to you if anybody out there knows where apples originated. I don't know if the camera can focus in on it, but I see a beautiful little bumblebee enjoying the blossoms on this tree. Fantastic. The insects are out and happy right now. Now this apple tree happens to be a crab apple, and I'm not sure why they planted crab apples here, but as a staff we've been challenged to enjoy the many fruits that it produces. So over the years volunteers have helped out, and we've made jam and jelly, we've made crab apple applesauce and crab apple juice that folks have enjoyed in some of our programs. If any of you out there are interested in volunteering when we can open our parks back up to your volunteer help, we are always looking for people who would like to get their hands in the soil or help us with our the food production that we have and making sure that it sees a good life and makes it out to public hands. So during the mission era, that's something that people were thinking about. The Spanish were interested in trees that produced food, that produced fruit, and there was an orchard. And I'm going to bring the camera over to get a long view over here of the silhouette in the back. There we go. So you see our adobe building, and behind it is Holy Cross Church, and we can see the steeple there. And so this is looking towards the north, more or less, and behind that church on the north slope of Mission Hill, during the mission era, that's where the orchard was. And so along with apples, stone fruits, citrus, there were olives and other trees like that that were grown in rows and an organized way, and that was a Spanish idea about growing food and fruit. We got one more tree that represents that era that I thought I'd give you a peek at right here and see if you can see. Do you see some glimpses of color in there in between the leaves? Let's see. Okay. There we go. So this is our orange tree, and it's got a few beautiful oranges growing on it, and it also has some twinkly lights there, and some of the blossoms are already blooming. We also have a lot of buds, so I'm imagining that in a few days or a week the profusion of buds will be beautiful, and I love the smell of the orange blossoms. It's a really, really rich scent. So sweet. So that's how some of the garden trees appeared to us during the mission era. And we're going to move on to another tree that represents another group of people who were living here on these grounds in this area in California history. Turning the camera around and honing in on the massive branches and profuse foliage of our tree. Now, if any of you have ever had a chance to visit the Santa Cruz mission here, you did not miss this tree because it's in the center of our courtyard and it makes quite a visual statement. It's such a beautiful tree. This is our avocado tree, and to be honest, I'm not going to go into full detail about it today because I think it deserves a program all of its own. But to place it in history, it was planted by the Rodriguez family, and so after the Mission era, this building that still exists, as well as other adobes in the area, were inhabited by the Californios. So these were settlers from Mexico who created in just a couple of generations a way of life and a tradition, and they called themselves Californios. So the Rodriguez family was part of that era, and they planted this tree. They lived here for generations, actually, and so we think that even though they were here from the 1840s, 1850s on, that this tree was probably planted around 1900 or so. It's a beautiful big old tree. And when they were planting an avocado tree, part of their reasoning was probably for avocados. The reality is that the fruits on this tree are not enormous. They're small with a large pit. It was actually planted before they were cultivated for market. So this is probably from an avocado pit that came from Mexico. And the Rodriguezes had a number of plants that they planted here. They had a vegetable garden that was obviously for food, but a number of plants that had sentimental value. And so there might have been a connection for them to Mexico with this tree. And other settlers came and lived in Santa Cruz on Mission Hill, and in this building in particular. And we had Irish immigrants, the Nearys and the Nolans, who lived in this building. And they had some other traditions when they were planting trees. So let's move around here. And got a couple of trees in the frame, right? And in the front, our persimmon tree has bright green leaves. It was bare. All those branches were bare just a couple of weeks ago. But I want us to focus our attention a little bit on the tree behind that, the one with the domed, there we go, with the domed top. And that is the monkey puzzle tree. And it was planted by the Nearys when they planted a lot of plants in this area, in the grounds here, and they called it Nearyland. Nearyland was a formal Victorian garden, and the monkey puzzle tree supposedly got its name when one of those Victorian fellows said, well, a tree like that would be a puzzle for even a monkey to climb. And so you can see all those branches going out to the sides. That's part of the splendor and the intrigue of the monkey puzzle tree. And during this time in history, suddenly people in the United States and England had access to these new plants, these new trees that botanists were discovering and finding on voyages to far-flung places of the earth and bringing them back home. And at the turn of the century, these specimens were available for planting in gardens, and it was quite the cultural tradition and status symbol to have plants and trees from all over the world in your garden. And the monkey puzzle tree hails from Argentina, and it has amazing cones and leaves and pieces. I'm going to leave you with a view of the tree and see if I can find you a branch to take a look at. Hang on just a minute. All right. I'm holding on to this branch very gingerly, very tenderly, because every one of these points is very, very stiff and extraordinarily sharp. And this is a branch from the monkey puzzle tree. It's an evergreen, so these might remind you a little bit of a fir or a pine, but each needle is in fact really, really broad. And we have to watch out for these on the grounds. They can be really painful if you're not expecting it. They're this sharp and this stiff and strong because these trees have been around for a long time evolutionarily, and they actually evolved so that dinosaurs wouldn't eat them. And so these are tough enough to combat dinosaur chompers. There we go, the needles of the monkey puzzle tree. So let's think about some of these trees and how they were planted, and I'm going to swing us around to some of the other trees that make an interesting connection here. I'll back up to take a look at these because they take up a lot of space in the screen. Do you recognize them yet, guys? Let's head up to the tippy tops. Got the sun rays in there. Oh, there we go. So we've got some redwoods here on the grounds, and of course redwoods are famous California native, but these trees are not natural to this location. There we go. The Neary family planted these as well, and if you imagine it, this was part of Neary land, but they were very small trees, and they were actually shaped and rounded as topiary as you walk through the pathways that past the bird baths and the statuary. So that's the role that the redwoods played in Neary land. And growing where they do without a lot of competition and a lot of sunlight, exposed to a lot of sunlight, these redwoods have been very happy. So they've grown pretty tall. But in terms of redwood life, they're still only maybe 100 years old, which makes them redwood babies that mature after maybe 500 years and can grow up to a couple thousand years old. I want to show you this redwood and what happened the other day, because there's our redwood, and then at the bottom we walked into work to find those enormous branches on the ground. Those rains over the not this weekend but the weekend before really had an impact on the landscape and the ground. It was a good time for visitors to not be here, but they're really fascinating to look at now. All right, well, I'm going to go out there one more time and show you one more thing about these redwood branches before we close up. So this might be familiar to you if you're from a part of California that has coastal redwood trees. These are needles that we often see on the trees. They're really bright, well, kind of a dark green and glossy and flat. So you can sort of see that the needles are flat on the edge. And I took this off the tree as well. So it came from, in fact, the same big branch, a set of branches, but this part of it, or this branch, we know was near to the top of the tree. So this one came from really high up. And you can see the redwood needles here are really different looking. They're very narrow, and they climb all the way around, whorl around the stem there. So the needles, both of these needle styles come from the same tree. Up near the top of the tree, they don't need to take in as much sunlight. And we also have two sets of cones. And you might see these pretty commonly on redwood trees. These used to be green, they've dried up, opened up, and the brown cones have released their seeds. But that's only the female part of the cone. So the male part of cones are these little yellow tip things, right? Oh, here we go, right there. And so they're going to be releasing the pollen. So that's the natural history, a little bit of natural history of the trees right here on our property, but they also tell a cultural story from people who manipulated the landscape for getting their needs met, as traditional California Indian people did, and the remnants of that on the landscape and how much it's changed, to the way that the Spanish brought in citrus, apples, fruit trees, grew them in an orchard in rows as food plants, to thinking about the Rodriguezes, who had food plants but also had sentimental value attached to the plantings that they made, to an era like the Victorian times when people had the opportunity to use plants for aesthetic means, as a stroll in the garden, to invite their friends to Nearyland and showcase plants that were available to them from all over the world. So that's our story for Gardens of Time today. I hope that you get a chance to tune in to us next Monday, once again at 2 o'clock, and we'll explore some more plants. We'll see what's blooming this spring. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.